Good evening, everybody. I'm Tina Weiss, the head librarian of the Mendel Gottesman Library, and I'm pleased to welcome you this evening to the inaugural Herman Prins Salomon Lecture. This evening represents a multi-year effort involving many people, beginning several years ago when Professor Herman Prins Salomon donated his multilingual Western Sephardic-focused Judaica collection, representing his areas of expertise and interest. With the great assistance of Dr. Dobrinsky and members of the institutional advancement team, and a true effort within the library to accession and catalog many of the holdings within this collection, and now with our inaugural Herman Prins Salomon Fellowship and Lecture. Of course, we had much additional assistance from the Office of the Provost and everyone at Yeshiva University Libraries. Of course, it should be noted that Professor Salomon and members of his family have a long-standing connection with Yeshiva University, including Professor Salomon's involvement in the creation of the American Sephardi publication. We look forward to tonight's lecture and future events that honor the scholarship and memory of Professor Salomon. What is especially fitting is Professor Carsten Wilke, this evening's lecturer, was directly connected with Professor Salomon. Thank you to our event co-sponsors, the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs and the Bernard Revel Graduate School. And I call upon Ronnie Borellis to introduce Professor Wilke.
Good evening, everybody. Tina, thank you. Thank you so much for all the work that you and the library did on this program, on this project. And soon enough, the fruit of the gift that was given by the Salomon family of his library to our library will certainly enrich YU as a resource for scholars and students all over the world. And it's really fitting that we have here tonight Carsten Wilke to give tonight's talk. Carsten is someone who I heard about for a long time through our mutual friend, Claude Shadinsky. And I finally met Carsten at a World Congress of Jewish Studies conference in Jerusalem. And I finally understood why he was always telling me, Ronnie, you really need to meet Carsten. Because Carsten sees the wide picture, but also can go very, very deep into the sources of the world that I have dedicated my scholarly life to, the world of the Western Sephardim, the Conversos, and so it was immediately apparent, but also because of his humanity, of his humility, of his integrity, of his generosity. And so it's really been a pleasure to get to know him better. I also want to say it's been really a gift to us that he's been here for a few weeks on campus, really from the first moment, really inserting himself into the life of the campus, came to great events. He's visited my classes. We've gone to on field trips together with my students, and it's been really, really special. So I really thank you. Thank you for coming here and for being really a member of the YU community while you're here as a guest, and really now I hope for a long time you should know that this is your home. You have a home here, a place to come back to, and it means a lot. And I have to give a few more thanks before the formal introduction. Tina mentioned the leadership of the library, the provost's office. Dr. Dobrinsky, who can't be here tonight, is someone that many of you don't know, but so much of what happens at YU happens because he worked for decades to raise the money, to make the connections, to make the networks work so that we have so much of what we have. And in particular, for my part of the world, the Sephardic Studies program here at YU was founded by the person that Rabbi Dr. Dobrinsky had up on his wall. His Moriva Rabbi, he would have Hacham Salomon Fellow, who was the great rabbi, scholar, intellectual, and leader of Sephardic Jewry. He was the chief rabbi he was the Sephardic chief rabbi of the British Empire when there was an empire. And he came here to New York in the 60s and immediately struck a chord with the Sephardim of New York, who really had very little leadership at the time. And with his efforts, with the assistance of Dr. Dobrinsky, they started the first Sephardic studies program in the country, right here at YU. So it's a very proud, long tradition that we have here at YU of appreciating the history of the Sephardim in all their complexity, in all their richness. And so I'm so thankful to him as well. I'll give a small official introduction to Professor Wilke, and we'll get on with the program. Carsten Wilke is a professor at the Department of History and Medieval Studies at Central European University in Vienna, to where his university moved from Budapest in 2020. You can read all about it. And director of the CEU Center for Religious Studies. He obtained his doctorate in Jewish Studies from the University of Cologne in 1994, and a diploma in Religious Studies from the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris, where he studied under supervision of the late Gerard Nahon, one of the great scholars of the Western Sephardim. Before joining CEU's faculty in 2009 in Europe, in 2009, he had many fellowships everywhere from Mexico City to Philadelphia and throughout Europe as well. In his books and articles, Carsten has researched transcultural aspects of Jewish religious history in a wide time frame with focus areas in Iberian crypto-Judaism, the Sephardic diaspora, Jewish historiography, and rabbinic reform movements of the 19th century. He's authored 5 monographs, most of these dedicated to the history of the Portuguese Jews, conversos, and new Christians, but also, because he's that type of scholar, he also wrote a book on the Song of Songs. No connection to the crypto Jews that I know. Again, it's my great honor to introduce Professor Carsten Wilke, and I really look forward to learning a lot tonight, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tina and Johnny. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I thank YU for the invitation to be the inaugural Herman Salomon Scholar this year, and I'm glad to see so many of you at this lecture. I'm quite excited to speak at Yeshiva University because its intellectual ideal has interested me for a long time. When I wrote on the ways in which Talmudic scholarship was first translated into academic frameworks in the 19th century in Prague and in Würzburg, I desired to know more about how Torah Umada works nowadays in our world, and I fell on the sociological study of Jeffrey Gurok, The Men and Women of Yeshiva, an old book that studies the institution. And I enjoy very much being personally part of the institution and working here in the midst of conversation in the library, in the Beit Midrash, on the corridors, often quite close to midnight. And recently in the elevator, students asked me what I'm researching here. And in the time that we had between the second and the 5th floor, so I explained them that I was interested in Sephardic manuscripts against Christianity from early modern Amsterdam, of which YU keeps some intriguing volumes. And he asked me, literally on one foot there in the escalator, why this was relevant. And I answered that those Jews lived in the exact time and place of Spinoza, and that they entrusted to these manuscripts their reflections about the big religious and political issues of incipient modernity that they mostly did not dare to declare publicly, but we can read them today. I do not know whether this was convincing, and I trust that a better explanation would have occurred to the late Professor Herman Prins Salomon, who had more passionately tracked down these dispersed secret manuscripts than anyone I know. You can see here his voluminous book with a meticulous list of volumes that he could locate either in Amsterdam, the city of his birth, or in his own hometown in New York, and everywhere between. I first met Professor Herman Salomon in 1990, 35 years ago, when I sat in his class at the École Pratique in Paris. The École Pratique, that's the venerable institution of E.S. Reva, the historian of crypto-Judaism. And as you might know, Professor Salomon was of those historians who negated this phenomenon altogether. According to him, the forced conversion of all Jews living in Portugal in 1497 had been followed by a quick assimilation of the new Christians to Catholicism. They were not the heretics that the Inquisition claimed they were. The Holy Office persecuted them out of ethnic prejudice and agreed to confiscate their wealth. Many new Christians fell back upon the religion of which they were accused and eventually embraced it as new Jews. I remember that at the end of his class session, Professor Salomon concluded with a sentence of which he stressed every word. It took more force and more violence to bring them back to Judaism than had been needed to separate them from it. So there was a shocked silence. He was sitting literally on the chair of Reva and saying such things. And one student, the late Sarah Moskowitz, fell in and said, "You're saying something terrible here." And then a discussion ensued, and since I intervened, he asked me after class who I was, and I told him that I was a doctoral student from Germany, and Professor Salomon replied, "Je suis néerlandais, nous sommes donc des voisins." I'm Dutch, we are therefore neighbors. And since we were neighbors, Herman invited me for a drink to a cafe where he immediately exposed a plan that he had. Many Germans, he told me, had repented for the Nazi crimes against the Jews, and he recognized this. However, the loss of life had been terrible, and we, as Germans, should feel responsibility for it. Would it be possible to convince a large number of Germans that it was their moral duty to fill up the ranks of Judaism by converting? Would I join him in the effort to bring 1 million, 2 million, perhaps even 6 million Germans to Judaism? I answered that this was a bold idea and that we would need a rabbi and teachers and donors. Let us do it then, said Herman. And now tell me about your research. I told him about the Sephardic manuscript literature that I had just discovered. I found a text that I believed went back to the 16th century, and Professor Salomon wanted to know everything about it. Some of the questions we raised had to do with conversion, even mass conversion, since much of this literature was written by conversos who reconverted to Judaism and wrote against a religion that they knew much better than the one they had embraced. We also noticed, Professor Salomon and I, that we had very different views of the very meaning of these manuscripts. Professor Salomon thought that these texts were actually written to convince Catholic New Christians and even Dutch and German Gentiles to change their religion for Judaism, whereas I sensed that their Jewish or crypto-Jewish authors and readers rather used the discourse of theological persuasion and conversion in a self-affirmative manner to feel more assured within their own religion in a changing environment. And we have corresponded on these questions over the years and over the decades. There is indeed a question, a difficult question. Why did Amsterdam Jews produce so many prominent texts against Christianity in the 17th, 18th century? While most catalogues of Hebrew manuscripts barely list a small handful of apologetical and polemical material, this genre occupies a bulky chapter in the catalogue of the Etzraim collection of the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam. In the 17th century, circulating texts in manuscripts, writing them and reading them, is a curious step back in book history when everybody was already using printed texts. Among Jews, early modern manuscript circulation generally had three reasons. Either one wanted to produce particularly decorated and colorful prayer books, or the texts were meant to remain esoteric, such as Kabbalah, or they were too subversive in the eyes of the Christian environment, and this is precisely our case. The cultural reference field of of this clandestine literature is extremely complex. These books were written by former New Christians from Spain and Portugal in Iberian standard languages, Spanish, Portuguese. They circulated in the Netherlands, in a Dutch environment when this country was an uncommonly multi-religious hub. They participated in the Jewish world with all its currents and all its complexity, Maimonidean rationalism, Safed Kabbalah, the Sabbatian movement, etc., the Haskalah later on. And they reacted to the growing trends in the critique of revealed religion that were characteristic of Enlightenment Europe. So, since we are in a library, let us start with the material traces and their provenance. Where can we find these books? And how did they come down to us? I have counted so far 271 volumes of Sephardic anti-Christian polemics, but the list keeps growing, and only these days I learned about 2 more thanks to Michel Margolis of Columbia University. There are some huge treatises of more than 600 folios, and there are thin volumes like the satirical micro-epic on Christ and the Magdalene of only 14 folios, which a collector found worthy of being bound into a volume by itself. Format varies between 5 and 15 inches, that is from the minuscule pocketbook to almost the contemporary A3 format. Most of these texts are in the Spanish language. First, because the Amsterdam Sephardim had not learned Hebrew in Portugal, and second, because Spanish and Portuguese had such a literary prestige that it became that Spanish became the first standard European language that Jews used for internal religious purposes, even when they knew Hebrew. These languages, of course, could be much better understood by non-Jewish readers than anything in Hebrew, so that there was a potential circulation for a text written in them outside the Jewish community. And in the mid-18th century, several works were translated from Spanish and Portuguese into Dutch, French, Italian, or English, languages that progressively became the new vernaculars of the Portuguese Jews. Most of the corpus has always remained the property of Jewish families and collectors. The seminary at Chaim in Amsterdam has the biggest collection of these books. 65 or so manuscripts, all of them now digitized in this wonderful on this wonderful website. But one should not imagine that all these manuscripts have stayed there since the 17th century. To be sure, a few volumes are there from the old Beit Midrash of the Portuguese community, but most of them were retrieved from family collections by 19th century bibliophiles, such as the famous David Montesinos. The second biggest collection, that of the Hamburg State Library, has a similar history, since most of it goes back to a heirloom of the Musafia family that the library acquired in 1859. Some manuscripts were in the hand of Christian collectors at a remarkably early time. And this is the case of the oldest dated manuscript kept by the Library Company of Philadelphia. I will only go to see the original next week, so that the reproduction is from a microfilm I have. The manuscript was written by Isaac Navarro, alias Jerónimo Nunes Navarro, in Amsterdam in 1652. Isaac de Miranda, a Jew from Italy, owned this book in the 18th century and brought it to colonial Pennsylvania. There he converted to Christianity and sold the manuscript to the mayor of Philadelphia, James Logan, the successor of William Penn. The manuscript contains a fairly comprehensive collection of works that existed at the time in this polemical genre. The anonymous Marrakesh Dialogues, written in 1583, the oldest specimen of Portuguese Jewish controversial literature, and the treatise against Christian dogmatics by the Dr. Elijah Montalto from Venice, early 17th century. Logan found the Miscellanea curious, and he left a note on the flyleaf that you can read there. This is a dialogue between a Jewish doctor or rabbi and a Christian about the Christian religion, composed, I think, in Morocco, in Spanish, by the Jew, from whence we may certainly conclude how the dispute is made to issue. It has different singularity in it, and especially of the Jewish nations, which render it a curiosity worth preserving. It belonged to Isaac Miranda, a Jew by education, who tore out the first pages or the first 12 leaves of it, whatever was written down there. I read it over in 1735, James Logan. Like Logan, some Christian scholars could acquire these subversive volumes from their Jewish owners, but it was a very expensive merchandise. Ralph Cudworth, professor of Hebrew at Cambridge, bought a volume in Latin in 1655, the Porta Veritatis, from Manasseh ben Israel, for which he paid 10 pounds sterling. This was approximately the price of a horse at the time. So imagine what would be the price of a car today. Cudworth borrowed the book to Bishop Richard Kidder, who took pains to write a refutation, but he found this book contained, I quote, the greatest effort against Christianity that I ever saw in any language whatsoever. And he imposed strict limits on its circulation. The volume eventually entered the library of Balliol College with these precautions. In a similar way, anti-Christian manuscripts entered the national libraries of Paris, London, Vienna, and elsewhere. For example, in Paris, a French bibliophile, the Marquis of Paulmy, acquired the essential library of Sephardic clandestine literature, Dr. Elijah Montalto, Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera, and Dr. Isaac Orobio de Castro. What may this French aristocrat have felt when he opened the latter's treatise, Orobio's treatise, and read right at the start that Christianity's pseudo-religion became, in the course of history, I quote, the most abominable belief and the most sacrilegious idolatry that human depravity could ever invent. No sect has been more offensive to the Creator's divinity, more contrary to the sacred law from Sinai, more pernicious to Israel and its holy land by its teaching, by its expansion across all or most of the world, and by its protracted duration. Dissident Christian thinkers, however, found these readings extremely thrilling. Anthony Collins got hold of 2 folio manuscripts on his own, works by Mortera and Orobio, which he had acquired in Holland at a high price. Collins wrote on Mortera's treatise, this work of his is esteemed by the Jews to be the shrewdest book they have against Christianity. They are forbid, under pain of excommunication, to lend it to any Christian, for fear of drawing a storm upon themselves, for producing such strong objections against the Christian religion. Wherefore, no copies are to be procured of it, but of the greatest excellence. It is not always clear why collectors were so fascinated by these items, but it is obvious that they appeal to many different interests. Jews sought them as symbol of a militant religious commitment. Christians sought to counter the affronts contained on them. Enlightenment rationalists sensed an elective affinity with the Jewish authors. Bibliophiles appreciated beauty. Let me now come to the time from which the manuscript originated. Roughly the year 1650 to 1750. Who wrote them? And for whom? So the rise of Jewish clandestine literature derives from several peculiar situations in history. First, there is the religious and cultural mobility of the Portuguese Jews, descendants of conversos or new Christians, great traders in the early colonial world, who founded a network of Jewish communities and created a Jewish religious literature in European languages. Second, there is Amsterdam, whose Sephardic community became the main center of the Portuguese Jewish diaspora. The city was outstanding in the degree of liberty that it offered to minorities and religious dissenters. Its multiple churches coexisted peacefully, yet entered into an intense religious argument, a phenomenon that historians call confessionalization. Every church developed its symbols, its dogmatics, its catechism, its social doctrine, its distinctive architecture, its spiritual classics, and defended these standpoints in the public sphere. In Amsterdam, Jews could play to some extent in this concert. but they were more limited than any other group in their expression. So why in this brawl is there no rabbi fighting with Luther, Calvin, and the Pope? Unlike any Christian or Muslim community, Jews did not praise Jesus, and that was the problem. Their religious discourse was the only one that was deemed intolerable and deemed blasphemous. In Hamburg, the Senate forbade public Jewish worship when accepting Jews in 1611 because they blaspheme against Christ. In Amsterdam, the city council and the Sephardic community board, the Mahamad, found another arrangement a little later in 1616. The Jews were free to pray and teach in the city, but the Mahamad was held responsible to make sure that no community member would ever speak or write anything against the Christian religion. That was the responsibility of the community board. Jewish self-censorship was therefore the price to be paid for acceptance. In practice, the Mahamad tolerated the circulation of anti-Christian texts as long as they remained in private and were not printed. The author Abraham Israel Pizarro, a convert to Judaism in 1685, echoed this conviction when he wrote in a letter to the Mahamad for a polemical manuscript that he feared that he would excite the resentment of the Christians, by which, he wrote, Israel would lose the calm, peace, and tranquility that it enjoys in these provinces. Considering these dangers, he promised to the Mahamad that he would comply with the rules of prudence, I quote, "I am sure that neither will your prudence be able to grant me permission to print this work, nor will my audacity dare to beg you for it in this regard. On the contrary, I recognize that the preservation of Israel during the calamity of the current times until the coming days of the happy redemption, for which we hope, requires that the truth be silent while the lie reigns." This is how Amsterdam Jews wrote their own chapter in the long history of Jewish writing against Christianity, under their own censorship. The fear of blasphemy distinguished Jews from other religious minorities. However, there was another group that secretly circulated anti-Christian texts in handwritten volumes at the same time, 1650 till 1750. These were the non-Jewish circles of deists, Spinozists, and atheists that developed arguments against the religion during the early phase of the European Enlightenment. It is called the littérature clandestine, clandestine literature in French, and the historian Miguel Benitez has counted about 300 different texts against Christianity, of which at least 2,000 copies seem to be extant in present-day collections. So about 10 times more than we have on the Jewish side. The most frequently copied text was the treatise of the three impostors, with about 200 manuscript copies, claiming that Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad maliciously invented their respective faiths. I show here an example which is said to have belonged to the Marquise Émilie du Châtelet, a French noblewoman who excelled in the natural sciences and was much interested also in the critique of the Bible. And the volume that comes from a library is called on the back Essay on Eternity, Dissertation de l'Éternité, which sounds quite devout, but it hides the fact that the first treatise is in fact called Essay and Proof of the World's Eternity, Dissertation et Preuve de l'Éternité du Monde. An anonymous text claiming to refute the doctrine of a creator God and to establish that the world is an eternal substance. And the second text in this collection, this one manuscript, is a dialogue with a Muslim. The third text is falsely attributed to Thomas Burnet and contains objections to the first chapter of Genesis. The third chapter ridicules the belief in miracles and prophecy. And the last chapter shows that Jesus was a false Messiah. Now, the first three pieces of Madame du Châtelet's volume would obviously be impalatable for a believing Jew. But the last one is in full accordance with Judaism for a very simple reason. This text was translated from Spanish into French, from a text by the Jewish doctor Isaac Orobium, I already mentioned. So this example shows that the clandestine literatures of the Jews and the freethinkers, or the epicorsim, intersected, but only partly. The Jews and the epicorsim jointly fought the same enemy, namely the Christian worldview and social order. But in doing this, they had quite different aims. The texts that the Marquise du Châtelet possessed give you a good example of the first stage of Enlightenment, which Jonathan Israel called the early or the radical Enlightenment. It is not yet about the rational reorganization of society, equality of all citizens before the law, public schooling and all those things. It's not yet about revolution. However, Israel showed that in religious terms, the earlier thinkers were much more radical than the later representatives of Enlightenment. The circle of the Marquise du Châtelet criticized even basic monotheistic convictions such as divine transcendence and creation, whereas later Enlightenment was revolutionary but believed again in creation. You all know we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, etc. This is religious. During the half-century between 1680 and 1730, Enlightenment belonged to a tiny critical elite of scholars, doctors, and as you have seen, young noblewomen who thought about religion with disbelief, quite different from the Enlightenment that one knows better later on. This secular transformation was both promising and threatening from a Jewish perspective. Both Jews and freethinkers had the same enemy. They used ways of communication that were both marginal and anachronical under the conditions of print culture. The two clandestine literatures, one produced by Gentiles in French, the other one by Jews in Iberian languages, present a parallel chronology and parallel features. Sometimes they even used identical texts. Jewish anti-Christian writing, however, differs from its non-Jewish counterpart, not only in the language, but also when Jews wrote clandestine polemics, they did not argue against the religious worldview. On the contrary, they searched to accredit it, their own religious faith. There are a number of other differences between these clandestine literatures. For example, as far as I know, there are no women among the authors and known readers of Sephardic manuscripts, whose discourse often searches a grave and pious style, whereas the French clandestine literature abounds with frivolous satire mingled with erotic texts. These arrive sometimes in the Sephardic texts, but they're not so frequent. Jewish clandestine literature remains concerned with authorship, authority, and literary glory, whereas Gentile freethinkers consumed a host of anonymous and pseudonymous pamphlets without developing the same trend towards the same notion of canonicity. Moreover, what is different between the two literature is the visual and material presentation, at least from the mid-17th century onwards. I told you with respect to the Philadelphia manuscript, we do not have any dated volumes from before 1652. Earlier texts, just as the letters and essays of Dr. Montalto, seem to have been an ephemeral literature before Jews in Amsterdam decided to collect them and copy them into bound volumes. The birth of a Sephardic manuscript culture with both aesthetic and theological ambitions took place 1 decade later in circumstances that we can reconstruct well, thanks in part to the research of Professor Salomon on Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera. Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera, the chief rabbi of the Sephardic community of Amsterdam, is best known for having pronounced the community ban, the cherem, against Bento de Spinoza. From that time, 1656, until the rabbi's death in 1660, he wrote a treatise defending Judaism. But the main argument that he tried to fight is not that of the freethinkers, but a form of relativism formulated by the Protestant jurist Hugo Grotius. All religions are based on traditions of miracles. We must either reject them all because they're all based on the same principle, and then we would fall into atheism and have no orientation at all anymore, or we must equally accept both testaments, the Jewish and the Christian one, and then we would share the Christian position. This is what Grotius formulates in his treatise against the Jews. The bone of contention already belongs to the Early Enlightenment in some way, since it is about the formalization of religion as a universal concept, a development that Guy Strumza has described in his book, A New Science, The Discovery of Religion in the Age of Reason. Mortera wrote a huge manuscript in the Portuguese language, but left it unfinished when he passed in 1660, as I said. The text was translated into Spanish by his assistant rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Rafael de Aguilar, who had come back from Dutch Brazil, and he gave the title to the text, God's Providence with Israel, Eternity of the Law of Moses, and the Vanity of all other religions. This long title summarizes well the content of Mortera's manuscript. First, God's providence, providencia de Dios con Israel, means that not the prosperity of empires, but the survival of the Jewish diaspora manifests the divine providence. And Mortera mentions the arrival of Jewish refugees from Brazil to New York as one of the examples of divine providence in this book. Second, Eternidad de la Ley de Mosé, the eternity of the law of Moses. The Torah that was given to Moses was meant, and Mortera explained this in all detail, all the different commandments, as an eternal constitution. And third, Nulidad de las demás leyes, the vanity of the other religions. Christianity and Islam are not religions in their own right. Religions are not equal. They are falsifications of the original Mosaic revelation in which they are founded. Aguilar worked together with a remarkable calligrapher. You see his work there, Judah Machabeu, who copied the manuscript in an exceedingly artistic way. And you see that there is also a certain series of production. The rabbi and the scribe, and obviously the wealthy members of the community, worked together to produce a series of splendid copies. Professor Salomon discovered the first one, the one in Cincinnati, Hebrew Union College, and others are dated and follow during the same years in 1662 to 1664. And this is, in fact, the hour of birth of this splendid kind of literature that we find now in different libraries. Bookbinding also intervened. So you see the two volumes of Judah Machabeu, D'Aguilar, Mortera, this co-production. They also wanted to be admired for their outward appearance. And a later copy of Mortera's treatise in possession of Columbia University, I had the opportunity to see it these days, amazes with its beautiful binding. It is due to Albert Magnus, the most famous bookbinder of Amsterdam at the time, the only one who could rival with a Parisian craftsman who had turned bookbinding into an art in the 17th century. The scribe, Abraham Idania, decorated the massive volume of more than 600 folios, that's the one I mentioned, with an imaginary drawing of Rabbi Mortera and with his own portrait at the end. The city archives in Amsterdam possess another volume of Idania's hand, and he may also have contributed the frontispiece of a volume in possession of the New York Public Library. So you see the way in which they are decorated is quite similar, and apparently from the same hand. There is a very revealing feature in the Columbia manuscript. Next to his portrait, Idania writes in Spanish, but in Hebrew characters. The full title of this book runs as follows: God's Providence with Israel, Truth and Eternity of the Law of Moses, and the Vanity of All Other Religions. We have not inscribed this on the front page. So you see there, it is just providence and the eternity, but not the vanity of the other religions. We have not inscribed this on the front page, which was done to that we will not scandalize our adversaries if they get hold of it. Therefore, we put that here in the present form. That means he writes that all this in Hebrew, so that not even Albert Magnus, the great bookbinder, could decipher this. We see here an amazing paradox of Jewish clandestine literature. On the one hand, Idania wants to display a book that is bound by the best bookbinder of Amsterdam in the most aesthetically refined fashion, as if he wanted to have it admired as publicly as possible. I have to show you this again. It's just enormous. It's just amazing. And on the other hand, he did not even dare to write the full title on the cover, because he was afraid of Christians who would take offense at the expression the vanity of the other religions. Obviously, he did not expect Christians to read more than the title. Though Christians avidly searched for these scandalous books, they were not meant to be presented to them. The aesthetic and symbolic qualities of these volumes show how much the function of the texts differs from the medieval models of Jewish polemics. These books were not so much used as guidebooks for actual controversies than as literary readings in their own right, serving a purpose of reflection, edification, recreation, Jewish identity. While dissecting the religion in which they had been born and bred, the Portuguese Jewish authors used Christian concepts and forms to make their own new religion meaningful and persuasive. We find now works written in vernacular literary forms that pursue literary originality in the genres of the Baroque age, from Erasmian dialogue to neo-scholastic treatise, from mystical poetry to anti-clerical satire. The Christian-Jewish conflict was aestheticized through rhetorical refinement, fictional narrative frameworks, and the visual embellishment of the copies. It seems thus that despite the theatrical aggressiveness of these texts, they were written explicitly for use among Jews. One Etzraim manuscript, a copy of Montalto's works, has an interesting possessor's note that shows how this text circulated in the Dutch Indies and the Antilles. It is written here in Portuguese: "The owner of this book herewith makes the vow that he will never lend it to any kind of person who will not first give him a sufficient pawn, a deposit, for the book." Curaçao on April 1st, 1753. And the owner of the book, who was rich enough to have this copied by someone else, he interestingly did not fear Christian zealots who would denounce his blasphemous book, but he feared Jewish borrowers who would not return it to him. Donors, scribes, owners, and borrowers formed a dense medieval-style network of manuscript production, consumption, borrowing, and copying. Authors wrote their texts consciously for the clandestine market. At one point in his treatise, Dr. Isaac Orobio de Castro cuts a long story short when he writes, "This would need a big volume, and since it cannot be printed, it would be extremely cumbersome to make copies of it by the pen." So he tried to be concise so that the scribes would not have too much work. When we notice that many of the manuscripts look like fake imprints, it becomes clear that the clandestine circulation of manuscripts allowed Jews to behave as if they were an equal part of Amsterdam's religious debate. This internal, even secretive literature did not aim to overcome the exclusion of Jews from many intellectual encounters, but to create a closed community which functions like a parallel public sphere. Look, this wonderful book it's also Yehuda Machabeu, and it really from afar, it looks like a splendid Venetian or Amsterdam printing, but it's all written by hand. More generally, the polemical texts deal obliquely with the doubts that were common among their readership, especially among Jews who were exposed to Christian propaganda and secular culture. Isaac Orobio was the first who encountered the arguments of Spinoza in his circle, heretics that rejected the need for a belief in religious tradition. And the fundamental task of the writers was not to make Judaism as such triumph over Christianity, but to reconcile tradition with a critical thought that unsettled the Portuguese Jewish community inside its new Dutch environment. At the end of his life, Isaac Orobio agreed to enter an epistolar debate with the Protestant theologian Philippus van Limburg and the philosopher John Locke, who published the texts in 1687. It seems that the Jewish community was subsequently much stricter with the repression of religious controversies, because they feared that Orobio might have gone too far. Though the production of clandestine manuscripts peaked in the 1710s, writers of the time became very careful in their contacts with Christians. This explains why the Silveiradas, 6 or 8 volumes, according to the count, of literary polemics that the Amsterdam private scholar Abraham Gómez Silveira directed against the Huguenot pastor Isac Jacquelot never became an actual correspondence or controversy. The two polemicists never met each other, never corresponded with each other, and in fact, Jacquelot died without even knowing that a Jew had written thousands of pages against his book. Abraham Gómez Silveira opened uncountable discussions with Christian intellectuals, but all of them remained strictly imaginary. On the pages of his huge manuscript volumes, he argued against a large number of Calvinist theologians, from Hugo Grotius to the contemporaries Jurieu, Abadi, Alix, Banage. He takes issue with the patristic authors, justifying religious coercion, and accepted by the Catholics, especially with Augustine. And he follows these ideas through much of Catholic pulpit oratory. In the further course of his work, he progressively ventures into the skeptic maelstrom of Spinoza, Richard Simon, Pierre Bayle, placing Judaism inside the critical interrogation on certainty, tolerance, and the autonomy of reason. Philosophers such as Locke, Mondeville, Montesquieu come into his purview. Consisting mainly of critical reviews, the Silveiradas adopt the generic traditions of religious controversy, but come to resemble the philosophical journals of the time, of which the author was an avid consumer. Gómez Silveira reads publications in French, in Spanish, in Portuguese, in Italian, in Hebrew, and in Dutch, reviewing everything in Spanish from a Jewish perspective for non-Francophone readers inside the Portuguese Jewish community who read his manuscripts. Who was this universally cultivated man? Abraham Gómez Silveira was born in 1651 from a Portuguese New Christian family in Arevalo, Old Castile. He grew up as a Catholic in Madrid under the burden of family memories. His mother and several other family members had been condemned by the Spanish Inquisition before he was born. In 1671, his mother took him to Amsterdam, where he entered the rabbinical school of the Jewish orphanage, pretending to be only 15 years old. By 1676, he delivered and published synagogue sermons. Then he moved to Antwerp as a businessman and became fluent in French there. He married in Amsterdam in 1694, working apparently as a stockbroker. As a widower living on rent income, apparently from the stock exchange in Amsterdam, he wrote in 1715 to 1725 his 6 volumes of theological reflections, to which he added 2 supplementary volumes before his death in 1741, almost 90 years old. Overlooking these 8 volumes of texts, one must conclude that no Jewish author of his time, and probably no Jewish author of any time, has written as much about Christianity as he. The series started as an intervention into a controversy between 2 Calvinist pastors from the French Huguenot refugee community in the Netherlands. After the expulsion from France, Pierre Jourieux decided that the world was still waiting to be redeemed from religious tyranny. Christ had to appear a second time, and he compared his views to the messianic expectations of the Jews, and he was caricatured for this. A fellow pastor, our Isac Jacquelot, decided to contradict this messianism, and he found the diplomatic solution in addressing his 1699 essay, Dissertation sur le Messie, Essays on the Messiah, not to Jourieux, but to the Jews, pointing out that all biblical prophecies were accomplished either by Ezra, by Jesus, or in the times of European expansion. Abraham Gómez Silveira at this moment felt obliged to respond, and in his manuscript he invited Jacquelot to an imaginary dialogue which fills the first 2 volumes of the Silveiradas, before he went on discussing many other books. Gómez Silveira fully masters Christian intellectual production, but he is guided by a thorough Jewish religious interpretation of reality and intellectual culture. As he often repeats, the Torah has been given once and for all, and, I quote him, everything modern is false. This constantly repeated conviction is his main argument against the Christian dogmas. This 18th century Sephardic polemicist thus anticipates literally the Jewish Orthodox slogan, everything new is forbidden by the Torah, which was coined by Moshe Sofer 1 century later. Kol chadash asur min haTorah. Personally, he believes that the Torah is the only universally accepted revelation and should be accepted as a yardstick of truth. This also means to accept the rabbinic tradition, since the meaning of the Hebrew language has only been transmitted among the Jews. All other religions are novelties and should have been repressed. But since they are now accredited, since they're there, religious controversy has become incurable. If the Christians disagree with the Jews and posit their own new alliance and New Testament, they only prove that messianic unanimity is still to be achieved. Even though there is a consensus about the holiness of the Torah, no modern religion can rely on evidence regarding its interpretation. Believers in the different faiths cannot convince each other, and the conclusion for Gómez Silveira is that, therefore, all religions need to tolerate each other. Pierre Baille's posthumous treatise on universal toleration motivated Gómez Silveira to formulate his own views. All religions, he agrees with Baille, should have the right to express themselves openly, and they should agree on an alliance against those who deny God. This is what he adds. He is very much afraid of the Spinozists and libertines, as he calls them, those who deny revelation or reward and punishment after death. These people should severely be persecuted according to the model of the Spanish Inquisition. So Gómez Silveira has reflected all his life on his vision of religious peace, but one sees that there is something open in his conception when he confronts these modernist movements and tendencies. In the supplementary volume, written in 1738 on the basis of journal readings, the author ends on a long, fascinating digression on the emergent Masonic movement which he defends as a potential new religion of mankind. He's completely enthusiastic about the Freemasons, and this is probably the first text written by a Jew about Freemasonry. The interest of this forgotten clandestine author justifies some remarks on the text. Can you give me another 5 minutes for the... Now we come to the part that interests the librarian. Some remarks on the text. There are 4 series of his Silveiradas. 2 in the Dutch Royal Library, 1 in Etzraim, Amsterdam, and 1 here at Gottesman Library at YU. Each copy counts about 3,000 or more pages, some a bit less, some a bit more. The YU copy consists of 6 stately volumes. Here you see the front pages. They once belonged to the Jews College, the British Rabbinical Seminary in London, and they can be read online. So you see, this is wonderful. Everything is now accessible online, and you can open the books and read them. By comparing the text versions, I could ascertain the following genealogy. One copy, one of the Dutch Royal Library, KB 76, is an autograph with many corrections. This first version was the model of the Amsterdam and Manchester manuscripts, which the author apparently produced in his family, since one and the same volume combines pieces in his own handwriting and in other hands. A revised autograph copy, his own handwriting, but including the changes of the first version, is extant in the Dutch Royal Library as well, KB 75, and the copy of Yeshiva University apparently reproduces this second model in a more compressed handwriting. So instead of 1,862 double-sided folios of the first version, there are only 1,339 double-sided folios. Much to read. But the entire finishing and copying process only took 2 years at most. Gómez Silveira dates his preliminary volume, which is part of the series, of 1723, and the YU copy has already the date of 1725. So this is maximum 2 years for all these manuscripts. There are some interesting examples of authorial intervention between the versions. Each chapter ends with a satirical section in Spanish verse, in the romance meter. And in the Libro Quarto, for example, there is one poem that is called The Dream and the Resolution, that appears in the first version as a monologue, and in the second version, the one copied by the YU manuscript, it has suddenly become a dialogue. So he brings in other voices, and his own voice becomes that of the Judío, because this dialogue is a dialogue between different believers, a Catholic, a Protestant, a Muslim, and a Jew. And very interestingly, he distributes his own voice from the monologue between the Protestant, the Muslim, and the Jew, and he adds the opinion of the Catholic, who is always on the oppressive side and who is the less sympathetic of all this quartet. At the end of his life, Gómez Silveira collected all those poems and edited them in another volume. This is the 8th one, if one wants to count it like that. And this quartet, in about 400, 500 pages, has dialogues and dialogues on their respective beliefs. There's a complete copy in Etzraim and a partial one in the Jewish Theological Seminary. And my colleague Herman Prins and I have an edition of the work underway, but only recently when we had this visit at Columbia University, Michel Margolis showed us a third copy that was not yet known, recently bought by Columbia University Libraries. So let me conclude. Sephardic clandestine literature continues the medieval model of Jewish polemics, but as I tried to show, several early modern and indeed early Enlightenment themes are reflected in this literature. This is Machiavelli's idea of religion as a fraud, which plays such an important role in the Marrakesh dialogues. No, I didn't want to show you this. It is this to show. And we see the discovery of conversion stories. We see the formalization of a universal and egalitarian concept of religion, the onslaught of the partisans of deism and natural religion. And for Abraham Gómez Silveira, the great problem is freedom of speech in a multi-religious society, the mutual toleration between believers and the common alliance that these should form against those who subvert all religions. Not only the ideas that Gómez Silveira expresses, the problems of free speech, religious peace, etc., express this link to the Enlightenment, but the very form and genre of clandestine literature in which he expressed himself. We have various theses about the participation of Jews in European culture. According to Jakob Katz, there was no change before Moses Mendelssohn, and not even Amsterdam was an exception. According to Jonathan Israel, there was an intense communication between Christian and Jewish intellectuals already in Abraham Gómez Silveira's time. And according to Shmuel Feiner, a groundbreaking change occurred already around 1700. However, I wanted to convince you that the situation is much more complicated, even ambivalent. A man like Abraham Gómez Silveira read everything he could, books, pamphlets, reviews, newspapers, all the languages. He had smart ideas on all of this, but he did not dare to confront Christians with the arguments that he had worked out against their dogmas in his huge volumes. He attributed it to the unredeemed state of the world before the coming of the Messiah, that Judaism did not have the same liberty of expression that all Christian denominations could enjoy, and that there would never be an open religious dispute among members of all religions. Clandestine literature had the functions to close this gap, to fill this gap in an imaginary manner, and overcome this experience of discrimination that existed even in the tolerant city of Amsterdam. The privilege that Amsterdam's Jews had was that they were allowed to turn censorship into self-censorship. They created a sphere of free expression among themselves, a sphere of which Christians became aware, so that the manuscripts became objects of desire. That was the title of a conference on these manuscripts for Jews, Christians, and freethinkers alike. Sephardic clandestine literature seems to die out in the 1750s. There are hardly any manuscripts copied after that date. Why? The reason may have been a general loss of interest in religion, perhaps the debate in favor or against the Jews stopped discussing the Bible and turned towards issues of economy and finance. But there may also be a more optimistic explanation. Maybe a certain triumph of these ideas of tolerance indeed made Judaism visible in the cityscape, as here in this 18th century prospect of New York, with its many steeples and communities, and number 12 is the synagogue, among many others. We might see Gómez Silveira's fictionalized and aestheticized theater of religious pluralism and religious controversy as a sort of literary rehearsal for a contemporary public sphere in which we are living. Thank you very much.
Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask?
Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. I learned an enormous amount. I wanted to ask you about your characterization of the corpus as clandestine literature. I mean, it's clear that clandestine literature is an important vehicle for the dissemination of enlightenment in manuscript as well as in printed form. I mean, there's 250 copies of the Trois Imposteurs, and then in the second half of the 18th century, I mean, the whole world that Robert Darnton has excavated, you know. I would have thought that what you're describing is not clandestine literature so much as esoteric. And I'm wondering about, in other words, if I think of the Voltaire puts the polemical seditious parts in Hebrew characters so that they can't be comprehended, right? That's impeding circulation, right? And you might, and I guess my larger question is, can there be Enlightenment literature that is esoteric, or is that a contradiction in terms? Because it seems to me that Enlightenment means, you know, a commitment to combating obfuscation and circumlocutions, making things clear. So anyway, clandestine or esoteric? I guess that's what my question. I would have thought that.
So I would define esoteric as, or esoteric literature, as a literature that for its character itself should not be printed, and the producers of the literature are convinced that they want to retain the control on who reads it and who is excluded from it.
Right.
The classical case in Judaism is Kabbalah,
Right.
which for a long time the authors did not want to print. But I do not think this is the case for the authors that we're talking about, because they're very often, or quite frequently at least, they mention the impossibility of printing as a sort of injustice. Gómez Silveira comes back to this a lot. They can all print. The Catholics print and the Protestants print and everyone prints, but we are the only one, we Jews, we have to stay silent. And Orobio also in this one passage that I mentioned seems to indicate that the ideal would be to print it all. Okay. But since we cannot print it, the plan B is to copy it by hand. So in this sense, clandestine is conveys the idea that this clandestinity, this manuscript circulation, is imposed from outside on the authors.
But I mean, but clandestinity is not opposed to circulation. It's a different mode of circulation, whereas the esoteric is trying to impede that process. I would have thought. I mean, clearly these manuscripts circulated anyway, but it strikes me that what you're describing, I don't know. Anyway, that's my question.
I mean, it's the question how to define these terms.
Right.
But I do not think that under other circumstances they would have hesitated to print these books. It was the agreement with the Amsterdam city authorities that prevented them from doing it, and not some idea that what they were writing should be kept secret or should be kept esoteric in a small circle. Yeah.
I just find it interesting that not only obviously the language is accessible to the Enlightenment thinkers who get their hands on these works anyway, but also the format. That these are like, in terms of it being dialogues, it's very much like Erasmus and more. It's very much like following this kind of revived classical dialogue, which is not usually something that you see in Jewish polemic prior to this community. So it's interesting just that they're using not only the language and not only refuting the arguments, but they're also using the same styles of hermeneutics and discussion and debate, which is just cool.
So it's 100% early modern form, Renaissance, Baroque, and then the 18th century treatises. And on the other hand, the content is partly traditional. It comes from rabbinic tradition, and there is a thesis by Daniel Lasker, who has published this several times, in which he said anti-Christian polemic, Jewish anti-Christian polemic in the early modern period hasn't invented anything. All the arguments exist already in the Middle Ages. So he claims, at least I do not agree with him, but one can have the impression that 100% of the content is medieval, but the form is entirely new. So there is a fascinating encounter also on the pages of this literature.
What do you make of the book? This is supposed to be a clandestine text. This has not, in terms of these as manuscript, the manuscripts themselves have none of the physical markers of what I'd expect of a clandestine text. Quickly copied, no elaborate illuminated title pages, no fancy bindings. I would have expected something that could pass without any notice, as plainly bound as possible. Why do you think they are creating such, in a way, luxury objects if these are almost, or perhaps not meant to circulate? What do you think the materiality of these tells us about the way they would have functioned as a communal object?
That's a good question. That's indeed, it goes into the history of the book and the function of the book in the early modern period, and where one would store books, who would have access to it, which are the quotidian situation in which one uses them. And I think I have the impression that in the 18th century especially, there were different levels of libraries. There were libraries to which, or parts of the libraries, where not everyone would have access. Later on in the 19th century, they invent the term l'enfer in French, which is hell, which are those parts that are very anti-religious, or they're very pornographic, or for some reason they should not be accessed by any user of the library. And especially the owners did not want others to know that they collected and possessed this kind of literature. So there was a corner somewhere in the library where one would store these books separately. And sometimes these corners were decorated and had their particular aesthetic. Like the name of the rose, Finis Africae, that plays on this.
And almost, you want everyone to know that you have the forbidden fruit, but they can't read it. In other words, is there some sort of unified style to these where within the Jewish community you see a binding that of a certain type with a certain title page with mostly Spanish and 4 lines of Hebrew, and you know that this is do you think it's a specific...
The rumor plays a role. The rumor plays an enormous role in the social prestige. Even, even today, that people say, one knows that he has a collection, a large collection of 19th century Japanese pornographic prints. He collects that. And of course, he does not show that to anyone, or to distinguish a close friend. Come, I will show you something. And then the rumor spreads. And exactly in the same way, in the 17th century, someone would say, Queen Christine of Sweden has the treatise of the 3 impostors, of which people speak since the 13th century. She has this. And this is part of the prestige. And in order to create such rumors, there must be some kind of a basis. And I imagine the situation that there is a certain selectivity in social contacts, style Freemasons. No, they played on this, that there is a certain small circle who is allowed to read the book, even to borrow the book, and there are others who would never know that I even have it. And for those few people, the binding of Albert Magnus would be impressive. Not to showcase this in public. This is how I imagine, but one should have a conference among historians of the book who might say, yes, I found this furniture here and there in this library where one sees where the free-thinking books or where the pornography was stored. Yeah.
So I wanted to go back to a comment you made just a few moments ago about the Daniel Lasker thesis. They mentioned that there's nothing new in early modern polemics against Christianity by Jews compared to the Middle Ages. There was one anecdote in your presentation. I can't remember the name of the author, the name of the person who purchased it, but you mentioned someone who bought a manuscript for £30 sterling and remarked to someone else that this book is the strongest, most powerful repudiation of Christianity that I've ever seen in writing. So what was it about that book that was so powerful to that reader? And was there anything new? It sounded like you don't fully agree with the Lasker thesis. In terms of content, Lasker does seem correct to me, just based on my anecdotal observations. What if Lasker is not correct and there was new arguments in terms of content? What were those new arguments, and what was so powerful specifically about that manuscript?
Well, one is sometimes surprised when one reads these reactions by Christians, because the same arguments appear in Hebrew texts from the Middle Ages already. But firstly, they might not have had the access to these texts because, well, they were in manuscript, they've never been printed, and they were in Hebrew and in difficult rabbinic Hebrew. Whereas Spanish everyone could read. That was like English in the 17th century. And I also think that those arguments appeared much stronger when they were put into scholastic or Jesuit reasoning, instead of the mainly exegetical reasoning that they have in the medieval treatises and originals. But I think I do not agree with Daniel Lasker, by the way, and I try to show that in the case of Hugo Grotius and his idea that Christianity and Judaism are standing on the same footing, and therefore Christianity wins. So it's not the medieval idea that Judaism is carnal and Christianity is spiritual, and Christianity is about the afterlife, and Judaism is about the reward during life, etc. No, it is a new view of religion as a concept. And I think there is a debate that is new in the 17th century with a number of perhaps not arguments but perspectives that are new. Yeah.
Okay. In the critiques, I'm curious: do they critique the figure of Jesus himself? And also, is there any indication that some of the critique is devoted to the Catholic Church and maybe not to the Protestant or Reformed version of the faith? The reason I bring this up is because a century earlier, one of the individuals I've studied, Emmanuel Tremellius, an Italian Jew from Ferrara, he brings with him, as he travels across the Alps, fleeing the Roman Inquisition, the Sefer Nitzahon, and he becomes a Christian, and he takes this book as a new Christian with him, which is anti-Christian. Thus was able to, in his own mind, contextualize the critique, and he was able to make sense of it in the sense that, for example, like one of the critiques was that Jesus was circumcised as a Jew. Why aren't Christians circumcised? So Tremellius was able to reconcile the critique and also hold to a Jewish Christian faith. And so is there any sense that some of these critiques Judaized Christianity, or were they completely hostile to every form of Christian faith?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It has been much discussed, because already the question why does this literature exist? the first answer that one has since the 18th century and Kaiserling in the 19th century, etc., is apologetic, and said that those people had so much suffered from the Inquisition that, in fact, even in Amsterdam, when they were writing against Christianity at large, it was always against inquisitorial Catholicism that they were reacting. But I do not think this is the case. I think most of the texts criticize the New Testament, just like the Dizertasiones, which goes through the New Testament. This is not in particular a certain denomination, which not existed, by the way, at the time. And in the 17th century, most of the arguments of Mortera and others are generally Christian arguments, or even half of Mortera is against Calvin in particular. So he aims at Protestantism, even sometimes at radical Protestantism, to say that, well, those who think that Jesus was the Messiah, even though he is not God, it's still mistaken. And they use Catholic examples in order to ridicule Christianity, because they are Catholic preachers that are particularly exacerbate their rhetoric, and there's also always this reference to Catholicism, but this compromises Protestants through their vicinity or through their cousins in some way. So I would not say that there is a particular focus on Catholicism. But that there's quite a wide sweep over the different denominations. There are different targets at the same time. I have not exactly understood what you meant by Judaizing through critique.
So in the case of Tremelli, at least in his own mind, he was able to hold some of the critiques of the Sephardic Clandestine and also believe in some of the claims of Christianity. And I think that he was able to Judaize Christianity in the sense that he contextualized some of the claims of Christianity in their first century context.
Ah, yes, I understand. Yeah, that's right. But this comes from the Middle Ages already. That the most quoted verse from the New Testament by far is Matthew 5, I have not come to suppress the law, but to fulfill it. And this is quoted over and over to show that Jesus, in fact, practiced Judaism and did not go beyond it. So it is an image, it is an argument according to which Christians, contemporary Christians, have left their roots in Judaism that are still positively affirmed by Jesus.
I want to thank all of you for coming out. It's late already, and I know people are busy, and there are finals on the way and all that. So thank you to all the students and to my colleagues who came out and friends from the community. It's really wonderful. Tina, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Really wonderful.